Harrison, welcome. It's good to meet you in real life. We've chatted a few times on the networks, just like randomly history-wise. So Harrison slid into my DMs, and that's how we got together. You're like, I have some problems, can you solve it? And I believe we solved it, and hence...
Like all good relationships.
Like all good relationships.
On Twitter, yeah.
Exactly, they start on Twitter. So yeah. So to start off this conversation, a lot of things changed, or I feel from our point of view, from December till quite recently in the market, and you have insights deeper than others. So what happened? Tell us.
Yeah, I think the models got really good and the harnesses got really good, basically. So we started paying more attention. So there's this idea of an agent that's basically a model running in a loop. And I think this has always been the North Star for agents. When LangChain launched 3 years ago, this was one of the things we had in there. AutoGPT, if you remember that.
I remember AutoGPT.
Yeah, that was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And that took off. And in many sense, I'd say OpenClaw is an interesting
inflection. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a new it's like a future version of it, but it's all the same core idea. It's just the agents running in a loop calling tools, and I think they started to get really good at this about a year ago, which I don't think as many people noticed as they should have, probably because they tried to run them in a loop and call tools and they didn't work.
And then they were like.
And then they were and this is why we built things like LangGraph to help structure those things in more kind of regimented ways. But then they started to work. This is when Claude Code came out about a year ago. Manus came out about a year ago. A lot of the deep research stuff came out about a year ago. And those all use the same running in a loop, but they also use this, I would argue, a very similar harness in terms of they have planning tools, they have file systems, a lot of them have code execution. And so I think this is really when harness engineering started to become more and more a thing. We started to pay attention in June, July, and released our version of the harness called Deep Agents around then as well. And then I think we kept we as an industry kept on building these harnesses and making them better and better. And then Opus came out sometime in November, and that really, because all these harnesses, the main exciting part of this harness is it lets the model do more and more things. It gives the model more and more control.
Breadth, or yeah.
Yeah, more just more control over what to do. There's less hard-coded things, and so the better that the models get, the more they can do, and the more they can do that reliably, and then they start to really work. And then I think what happened is everyone went on Christmas vacation and started playing around with them, and then they realized that it started to work.
Yeah, so you've written a bunch about deep agents and stuff, and there's an article that you wrote which I liked a lot, which is why didn't I write that article? Which is when we started Daytona as this Sandbox vendor, we essentially pushed away from running agents inside the Sandbox because we felt that that's that is production versus development, outer versus inner loop stuff. And so we always thought the agent would sit outside, and then you'd call it a tool call, a human calls, it turns on your computer. But now, especially with Claude Code and all these others, where the agent sits inside of these things, and so you had this Twitter article, I believe, which you went into this. So,
yeah, I mean, and I'd love to get your take on this because I'm asking everyone what they see because basically we see people running sandboxes in two different ways. It's about a 50-50 split. And it's funny, when I wrote this Twitter article, I had people on both sides telling me I was stupid for thinking the other side was even a possibility.
That's why you have a lot of viewership on this. It's great. Yeah.
But the two things we see are one, you stand up your sandbox and then you install the agent in there and you run it inside of there. Or you stand up your sandbox, you stand up your agent separately, and you have the agent call it as a tool. And those are the two patterns we see. There's pros and cons to both of them. I think practically what we've seen is that if you're starting from something like Claude Code, which is very much meant to be run kind of locally,
yep.
Then the first pattern of you just stand up a sandbox and install Claude Code makes a bunch of sense. If you're coming at it from kind of fresh eyes or from an existing agent and you want to run it in a sandbox, most of the time then we see people actually standing up the sandbox separately and connecting it as a tool. But it really is a 50-50 split. I don't know, are you seeing anything?
Yeah, so we see both on our side, and the interesting part is as a provider of sandboxes, you have to have different tools for each of the use cases, which is also an interesting thing that you have to do. And the way I've understood it, you articulated it as well, is I feel that people are used to using Claude Code on their local machine. And so how to get an agent to do something? Well, the easiest thing is fire off a sandbox and put it inside. You don't have to think about it. It's kind of redundant, but it is an easy way to get it up and running. I believe personally, and this is not the view of the company, but me as a person, is that it's better to have it outside because then you can have like, you can spin up multiple sandboxes, you can fork these things, you can have knowledge of state of these things across versus if your agent is inside a sandbox and for example, you fork it, it actually doesn't know it's a clone, right? It is the same thing. So we're seeing both, but that's just how I think about that.
I think I'm probably aligned with you. I think the separation of like the agent's execution environment and like the sandbox's execution environment, I think that's a nice separation to have, but we'll see.
How does that affect your tooling or your products around that, depending on how people decide what to do?
So we want to support both.
Yeah.
So deep agents, which is our agent harness, I think you can pretty trivially run any of these things inside a sandbox by just spinning up and installing. But one of the pretty unique things that we have in deep agents compared to like Claude, Agent SDK, or something like that, is it has this like sandbox abstraction that you can basically pass into deep agents. So we have Daytona as a provider, and basically you pass it in there, and all of the code execution that the agent does, that gets executed inside the sandbox. And so we have a few different primitives for that and a few different hooks. And we have a few different providers, including like a local provider, which is basically just use the local file system. Yeah, and so that's something where we've tried to support that a lot and spent a lot more time there because we do think that's a pretty valid deployment option. And I think that's a lot of the other like harnesses we see out there are coming, it's kind of funny, like I'd say a harness is somewhere in between a coding agent and a framework. And we started with a framework LangChain and kind of like went up towards deep agents. Yeah, and then you have Claude Code, which is a coding agent, and went down. And so I think a lot of these coding agents don't have that naturally kind of like built in because they're so built to be run kind of like locally.
Locally, yeah, that's exactly, because it's the easiest way to use them.
Yeah.
And so what do you see as like, you guys as sort of like integrate with all these tools? And I talked earlier with Parag is like the infrastructure layer is like Sandbox is web search, obviously, because he does that. File systems, we have Aaron later on talking from Box as well. These things. What are the other things? Like, what do you guys see that people use? Is there anything there?
Yeah, I mean, there's the models, obviously. One of the really interesting things we're paying attention to, by the way, I saw Lynn on earlier from Fireworks, is open source models. Yeah. Like, I think practically, if you ask, if you want to use one of these harnesses to their full ability, you probably need an OpenAI or Anthropic or maybe a Google model at the moment, but we are very, very excited for open source models. So the models one, this harness that connects everything, I think is becoming a bigger and bigger piece of the puzzle. And obviously, there were a ton of frameworks before, but I think a harness is more powerful, it's more batteries included. I think you're much more likely to, like I think the main value of a framework is abstractions, which can be good or can be bad. The main value of a harness is in a lot of like the batteries that are included, and I think that's more naturally valuable. So I think this is a big piece. I think things around like memory are really important, and so this includes both just like short-term kind of like conversational memory, but also long-term procedural memory, semantic memory, which is also very similar to RAG. So like there's some sort of like database, data structure that's needed to support this memory. I think that's a big piece. Sandboxes are a big piece because we see code execution being a critical part of a lot of agents, not just coding agents. And then there's a long list of tools. Search, web search is definitely probably at the top of that list, I would say. Yeah, there's such a long tail, but like the biggest like individual tool providers that we see, I think have always been kind of like web search ones. I mean, we think observability and evals are a core part of that stack, kind of like orthogonal. They make sure that the agent's actually working as intended. I think those are what I would say are like the standard parts right now. I think in the future, I think there's a lot of buzz around kind of like agentic payments, for example.
Like what Stripe launched recently.
Yeah, that's something I think is still early, but like we're excited to see where that goes.
Authentication? Anything on auth, like for the agents or whatnot? Yeah,
good question. I mean, so that ties into kind of like the long list of tools. We're thinking a bunch about this. We see kind of like two different patterns there. One is like agents that authenticate on behalf of a user. So it uses kind of like, so if I use it and you use it, we'll get different results because it uses, my Slack credentials
versus mine, credentials.
But Another type of agent is kind of like an autonomous or like claw style agent, and this is like I think modeled after OpenClaw, where OpenClaws they basically have their own identities. They've got their own memories, they've got their own credentials. Those could be the same as their creator's credentials, or they could be a service account. And so I think this is a separate paradigm. I think there's two different paradigms of agents and auth around them. And so yeah, I think auth is becoming an interesting kind of like differentiator for these two different types.
Tell me about like as much as you can about memory, because that's where I'm personally the lowest. Is like you mentioned like 3 types of memory. Are there like standardizations around that? Do you guys have internal memory for the agents that you guys create, or like tell me more about that?
Memory is like so new, or it's not even new. It's not new. It's just like
Unsolved.
Unsolved, yeah. We've been thinking about memory for like 2 years. I think we still have like pretty low level primitives because I think there are ideas about memory, but I don't know if like a higher level primitive right now makes sense. So like, there's short-term memory, there's long-term memory. Short-term memory like is what happens within a conversation. That's large, there's some interesting questions there around like compaction when the conversation gets really long.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like the main open question there. Other than that, that's relatively solved, I'd say. And then for long-term memory, and a lot of my learnings here, I've learned so much more about human psychology in the past 2 years than ever before. Because of this, yeah. So there's 3 types of memory for humans. Episodic, procedural, and semantic.
Okay, tell us more.
So semantic is basically searching facts. And so semantic search would be a great way to do this, right? And I think we know how to do that. The interesting question here is like, how do those facts get put into the data structure?
That was my question. Yeah, you can do semantic search, but against what and where is that? Yeah.
So I think we see one, like I do think there's a difference between knowledge and memory. So like knowledge would be like, hey, let's ingest like I don't know all these documents and put them into a database, and great. Like semantic search over that is solved. Memory, I think you kind of like learn on the fly almost. And so I think there's 2 ways to kind of like update memory, not just for semantic memory, for all of these memories, but there's 2 ways. One is to basically have the agent do it as it's running. So the agent, as it's running, if you say like, I like ice cream, the agent could call a tool that like puts that into a database.
It's like, yeah.
Yeah, and it does it as it's running. The other way would be to run basically a cron job that runs once a night or once whatever we want, and say, hey, look over all previous interactions and like store stuff.
This is what we do when we sleep, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, sleep time compute is a great name. The folks at Leda came up with that.
Yeah.
For basically doing that. And so semantic memory would probably be putting them in some sort of database that supports semantic search. Episodic memory is easier. That's just like previous interactions. And so the way you can do that is you can just give the agent a tool to look at its previous conversations. It can just look it up.
Yep.
I think the most interesting is procedural type of memory, which is like what the agent should actually do, like its core instructions. And so to me, this is things like the system prompt and the skills it has and maybe even the tools it has. So this, again, there's the question of how does this get updated? Does it get updated by the agent like editing, those things as it goes, or in the sleep? But like that's to me the most interesting type of memory, because I think that's really useful for, like I think a lot of the value of agents is having it do things for you, and a lot of those things are oftentimes repeated. Like I have an email agent; it looks at every single email.
Slack agent, same.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very repeated action. And if I correct it once, like I don't want to have to correct it a second time or a third time.
Learn this thing, yeah.
Exactly. And so that type of like procedural memory, I think that's the highest impact. That's the type that we've probably built the most into the framework. Although again, it's very low level abstractions because we think it's still really early, but that's, yeah.
So 2 questions on that. Do you think that's something you solve, or are other people solving that as products? And third is like on a more technical level, is that just like a Postgres database, an SQLite database, or is there something else being built there?
Yeah, I mean, on a technical level, you can use, specifically for the procedural stuff, you can use anything to store them. I mean, we oftentimes represent them as files to the agent.
So they don't know it's a database, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we have this thing, this is another cool thing that we have in deep agents.
Everything is a file, was a tweet.
Everything is a file, yeah. We have like a virtual file system, and you can edit them, you can remove them, you can read them. And that sounds basic, but if you have really long files, you actually want to give it pretty special tools for reading only like certain lines, or for editing. Editing like a large document is actually kind of tricky. And so having those tools, or having those things represented as files, and then just having one set of tools for interacting with files is really useful. But under the hood, yeah, it could be anything.
Is there like an issue on like speed and latency? Because I know we have the different ways we connect to sandboxes, and like if you do a fuse mount, it's kind of slow for these things. If you do like, are there issues there with the agents? Is there something that has to be faster, closer, or whatnot?
My honest take is the calls to the LLMs are like much longer than any of these things take, and so I don't think we haven't heard many people talk about that as a priority.
So then the biggest problem is just like, reading over the files, so getting access to them faster, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem is oftentimes kind of just like integrating with the customer's infrastructure. Like if they have Postgres, they want to use Postgres. If they have MySQL, they want to use MySQL. And so honestly, like I don't think we see, actually, so we do have two operations, glob and grep, which are a little bit more complicated. Yeah. And so those, if you implement incorrectly, those can take a while, and those will actually like block the agent. Like I think we had a bug at one point where I think it was grep was taking like a minute or something like that.
Yeah, and then
it's
like too long. Yeah.
But if it's like half a second versus like, I don't know, 200 milliseconds or something
doesn't
like
matter,
that, doesn't matter.
Got it. One thing we're talking about backstage, and this is, we also have to change this in our original tagline was run AI code, and hence everyone thinks we just execute code versus having a full-on machine. And so we were talking about this earlier, and when we started as well, we believe that all knowledge work can be distilled to code. But also in the meantime, we kind of believe that, or have seen, that there's a lot of knowledge work that's still locked in like legacy software. I'm making this up. A plugin for Excel to do something, right? And so your agent needs sort of a computer use to do those things. Do you guys solve for that? What do you think about it? Because I know you also talk about like every coding agent, every agent is a coding agent, sorry.
Yeah, I think practically speaking, we see that like browser use or computer use is probably not as ready for prime time as like coding, basically. I mean, I think even last year we saw some models specifically released for this, and I don't think they were good enough for a lot of people to use them reliably. I did chat with some folks maybe a month or two ago that did say that some of the newest Opus models were pretty good at it, so I want to give it another shot. But I think like, yeah, we don't see a ton of people doing that because the models they're just not good at it. They're a lot better at code, so we see a lot of them writing code. As you pointed out, yeah, there are definitely some kind of like APIs or not APIs. There are some websites that don't have APIs, and so you can't use kind of like code against them. And I think that is a lot of the excitement around browser use and stuff like that. But I don't know if we've really seen that come to fruition yet.
Yeah, my take is that it's a quarter or two from where we are. We're not there yet. Is there anything that changes in your harness and frameworks for that specifically?
I don't know. That's a really good question. That's why I kind of want to look into it. I think like it could just sort of like right now with deep agents, we've got some tools for interacting with the file system, some tools for interacting with Bash, with executing stuff, a planning tool, and then you can bring your own tools. And so like, I don't know whether this is just another tool that gets added or whether this is a completely separate harness. I don't know. Yeah. Like I'm really excited to play around.
So we'll play around with this soon, hopefully together on some of these things. Last year when I was at your conference, which is one of the inspirations for our conference as well, you and the Upfront people, I noticed that, I mean, when I talk to the community here, it's more like bottom-up developers that consume you guys. But there was just like, I won't name names because I might get them wrong, so I don't want to attribute customers that are our customers, but they were like big companies that use you. And so how is that running a startup, although you're like a quite big startup now, like both at the same time, PLG, enterprise, like what's the mix? How does that feel? What are the constraints on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we noticed pretty early on is basically everyone wants to do stuff with Gen AI.
Yeah.
If you're at a startup, like you're absolutely in it. And if you're at an enterprise, there's both kind of like bottoms up, like interest in doing it, but also top down because everyone's getting asked about it. And so it kind of just hit everyone at the same time. Like it really came out of nowhere. And so we definitely think about serving kind of like both audiences. I think like how we think about things maybe differs a little bit by product actually. So we have LangSmith, which is a big thing that's out there is basically like we spend a lot of time thinking about what do the agents of the future look like? And I think oftentimes the agents that people build at startups, they actually do look different than the agents that people build at enterprise.
Can you explain more, like what are those differences? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, at a startup, you're far more likely to build something like Claude Code that is just running in a loop and doing stuff. And at an enterprise, this is where we see things like LangGraph really shine because you need more precision, you need more control. It's not okay to have 95%. You need some of that certainty for that. This step's always going to happen after that step. And so that's LangGraph is one of our frameworks that's really good at mixing deterministic code with non-deterministic code. And so it lets you structure it in that way. And so like LangGraph, I think, is probably much more popular in enterprises. Things like deep agents, much more popular in startups. Right now, we expect that those will make their way for sure. But like, so the open source kind of like harness place is one place where we definitely see different appetites for different things depending on where you are. Langsmith, which is our commercial product and really centered around observability and all the cool things you can do if you have good observability, including like annotations and evals, that is actually pretty universal across startups and enterprises. And because no matter what your agent looks like, you're always going to want to know what's going on inside of it. And you're always going to want to like measure it when you make changes and have some idea of how it's doing. And so that tool, pretty universal. The harness, absolutely changes between different customer bases.
And how is the usage? So when we talk to people as well, for us is like some people think of agents as, oh, I as a singular person will now construct an agent to do a task or multiple tasks for me, which is fine, like your email agent, like my Slack agent, whatever. But when we think of like actually where the growth of infrastructure companies like ourselves it is more of like agents as a service. So like software as a service that's running hundreds of thousands of millions of agents underneath that. And so, and for us, it was like a hard sell 6 months ago, especially to larger enterprises, because they're like, oh, I just need agent to do something on the desk of this person. So have you seen that? And do people use you guys for, I don't know if the term is agent service, I don't know, it's like a SaaS with the agents versus like the single person user?
I mean, the enterprises, the companies that are having the most success are definitely scaling it to like all their user bases.
Okay.
Clay is one company that we work with that is I think one of like pushing the pace in terms of the most kind of like aggressive Gen AI native companies out there doing things. They obviously expose it to all their users, and so whatever they're using under the hood is used by a bunch of different folks. Cisco, they sponsored our conference last year. They were one of the key sponsors. They're actually doing an incredible amount.
Good to know for next year.
Yeah, they're doing an incredible amount with AI. They're using it super heavily in their CX org in particular. And that also is scaled out across like all their different customers, right? So it's not like, and so when they find that impact, it's not like they're just building a single agent for themselves internally. They're building it out and scaling it across all the different users.
Got it. The last thing I wanted to sort of ask you is, we actually haven't mentioned, like you said once, RAG in this entire conversation. And so like historically agents were just basically RAG agents and they've evolved, and is that no longer a thing? And like you also mentioned that you think about like the future of agents, and like so from what you see, like where is this going? What is the next sort of iteration of them?
I think you still need like RAG. You still need ways of getting data. I think it's just I think as a lot of RAG has become tools that you can give agents, and as agents have learned to actually learn from their own mistakes in calling tools, I think the need to have like a super precise RAG tool has probably gone down, because if the agent doesn't get the right results the first time, it can call a second time and a third time, and like, yeah, that's not as efficient, but the models are getting really good at this and fast enough and getting cheaper and cheaper, and so it's not the end of the world. But you still need some basic tool, and there are probably some cases where if the tool is really bad, the highest value thing to do is build a better RAG system to power that tool. But I think it's just turning into one tool of many, and so I think that's probably why we talk about it less. But like pretty much every company we work with does semantic search in some fashion. Yeah. And
so one more thing is, where is Harrison's head right now? Like, what are you like noodling on to launch at LangChain?
I mean, I'm thinking a lot about these agent harnesses and what they look like. Some things that I'm thinking about there. I think the boundary between like an agent harness and an end user facing app is actually very slim. Like I think Manus is an example of this, where they have a fantastic agent harness and they've written a bunch of really technical blogs about what's going under the hood, but they're obviously best known for their application, and like those are pretty tightly coupled. You look at Claude Code, that launched an application, now is exposing more of their agent harness, so it's very, very slim there. And so I think right now at this point in time, those are pretty kind of like close related. We obviously think that there will be a ton of different agents out there, and so part of our idea in building deep agents is to help make it easy to just let all these different applications kind of like bloom. But one of the things we're also working on is like a pretty generic, like no code, low code kind of like agent builder concept built on top of this harness, because it's so related. And like if you understand, this is also now gets into kind of, okay, this is maybe a separate thing now, but another thing that since you asked, like the idea of memory as just being, like memory is what makes an agent. Like if you have this harness, like what's different between one configuration of this harness that does like research and another configuration of this harness that does code writing? It's the system prompt and the skills it has and the tools it has, and I would argue that you could say all of those are procedural memory. So then like the memory of the agent defines the agent, which I think is a very nice encapsulation, because then you can like zip up the agent files and say, hey, this zip file of markdown files is an agent.
Is essentially the agent.
Yeah, and then you can port that between harnesses. Like could you take that zip of, most agents support kind of like agent.md, and the skills take that from Codex and bring it into Claude, although Claude's a bad example because they don't support that yet, but bring it into Cursor or something like that. And so I think this idea of like portable memory, really, really interesting as well.
Awesome. We're out of time. Harrison, thank you so much. It's been a joy.
Thank you for having me.